Good morning to everyone who has chosen to attend our event on exploring the ethical dimensions of managing COVID-19. Welcome to you all. I'm really pleased to introduce this event in my capacity as the theme lead for the research theme Society, Culture and Law. I hope we will have a good 1.5 hours of what will be quite high speed impact of thinking about how ethical dimensions and questions of moral injury and researching these questions in our current environment have been panning out in the recent past and where we think we will be going in the future. So I will briefly introduce our session and then go pretty straight into my own presentation, and then we will have David Whetham and his team, Professor Martin Bricknell, Professor David Whetham, I should have said, Professor Martin Bricknell, and Dr. Marina Miron presenting their the evolution and the rationale behind their ethical playing cards, medical ethical playing cards, and that's followed after half an hour by Dr. Rachel Kerr and Dr. Maria Varaki talking about research questions and doing research in our current environment. So where does this entire session sit in the wider theme of the series of conference events that you've already been participating in and of which we are one? The global COVID-19 pandemic poses a threat to societies around the world of a magnitude and complexity very few have experienced in their lifetime. It comes at a time when some societies are engaged in what might be described as culture wars, which have begun to spill over into global politics. In both domestic and international contexts, the fault lines in the liberal rules-based order have become exposed, the order and its underpinning norms challenged. How societies will get through and in what shape they will ultimately emerge from the likely long and arduous recovery depends not least on how we negotiate the ethical or moral impact of both the pandemic and the approaches to its management. My focus in the next 10 minutes on this is on the need to recognize and understand the risk of moral injury in dealing with COVID-19 at a strategic level in professional contexts and for citizens. My aim will be to chart a first analytical framework. Sorry, that is one of those hiccups. I do apologize for that. My aim is to chart a first analytical framework within which we can begin to examine how and why civilians experience moral injury and what might be done to prevent or remedy it. I will draw largely on work done in conjunction with moral injury in service personnel, and I'm aiming to translate this into a civilian context on which relatively little research exists so far. As I said, this will then be followed by by David Whetham and his panel talking very much about the medical environment. So I will not major on this. And then Rachel and Maria will bring up the rear. I should let you know how we're going to run this. One, the event is currently being recorded and live streamed to YouTube, and it will be put on YouTube in the archive. So should you have second thoughts on this, please consider perhaps not watching now and doing this later. If you wanted to engage with the event via Twitter, then please do so. The hashtag is hashtag global shocks. Questions and answers, please post your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. And hopefully we will then be able to answer as many of the questions and have a lively debate going as we go through the session. So I shall now begin. I do apologize again. I shall now begin my own presentation. Managing the COVID-19 pandemic demands extremely difficult and ethically charged choices of strategic decision makers in governments and organizations, as well as of individuals in key professions, businesses, and as private citizens. The impact on the emotional and psychological well-being of health and social care professionals is increasingly recognized. Neil Greenberg at the Academic Department for Military Mental Health here at King's recently flagged up the need publicly to treat NHS staff for post-traumatic stress disorder. and thought that some of the work done with the military might actually be quite useful for this already. But the risk and potential consequences of moral injury has so far been rarely discussed. One exception is military ethicist Peter Lee's recently published contribution to Global Focus, Deciding on Life and Death. There is furthermore no discussion or exploration yet of the risk of moral injury to private citizens or potential correlations between moral injury and government decision-making. But why should we inquire into COVID-19 related risks and manifestations of moral injury in civilians? On one level, we can see choices, rational choices around the management of the pandemic as primarily concerned with material realities of life, the search for scientific facts, and consensus on containing the spread of the virus and minimizing the impact of the disease, not only on the health of citizens, but also the immediate and long-term economic costs at national and global level. They demand a weighing up of risks, again, a rational activity, with an understanding of decision parameters that is only inadequately described as suboptimal. We all operate within an especially large number of unknown unknowns, to partially quote former US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Managing that risk and the impact of decisions on individuals and society with all its aspects of material and ideational life comes with ethical or moral choices, whether these are recognized as such or not. Add to this the pressures of capacity, for example, protection such as personal protection for healthcare and social care staff, testing or economic assistance, time before people die, time before businesses collapse or citizens are made homeless, and space of relative safety, for example, which is not necessarily at home. And it is almost inevitable that one morally right choice means having to tolerate and live with the consequences of moral wrongs elsewhere. What is more, perceptions of such professional or public policy decisions are likely to be filtered through a measure of justice and fairness. Both these decisions and their reception have rational as well as ideational and emotional dimensions. Personal accounts of health and social care professionals abound of the harrowing choices they have had to make in circumstances whose pressures were familiar only to those who had experience of disaster relief operations or assistance to other societies stricken by epidemics. Having to deviate from practices and professional ethical norms that have so far guided their decisions on life and death without being prepared and having to make such choices repeatedly is likely to have dislocated the moral compass of many. Not only did they have little time to adjust their personal and professional ethical decision framework to the extreme circumstances, but they had to accept that in order to make one morally right decision, they risked also inflicting moral wrongs. Over time, this dynamic can lead to moral injury in individuals, but the damage potentially extends to wider society. Why? It is critical for estimating the potential impact of this risk that many citizens around the world have, I hypothesize, experienced social injustices as morally injurious in their daily lives well before the outbreak of the pandemic. Those of you who participated in yesterday morning's panel on the ethics of social solidarity, community and care will have heard presentations and discussions that speak pertinently to the problematique of social injustice. If you have not, I strongly recommend that you look up the recorded session on YouTube, which should be available soon. Looking at the situation through the lens of moral injury, the risk of both a deepening of pre-existing moral injury and a spread to many more citizens, for example, those who used to work in so-called middle-class jobs and are now potentially being made unemployed, needs to be actively acknowledged and incorporated in decision-making, especially at the strategic level. If not addressed, its effects are potentially highly disruptive to individual lives, the fabric of society, and the relationship between the electorate and governments, and through that, international cooperation without which a global pandemic cannot be controlled effectively. We do, however, need to gain a better understanding of the multiple dimensions in which civilians can be morally injured and how we might be able to prevent it or at least facilitate a healing process. What can we learn from research conducted with the armed forces? While still lacking a commonly accepted definition, the concept of moral injury has been coming of age over the past nearly 2 decades now through research on the phenomenon in armed forces. Especially in Australia and the US, but also to an increasing degree here, moral injury is increasingly acknowledged as a phenomenon distinct from, but with some similarities or at times coexistent with PTSD. Moral injury can be caused by significant experience of morally dislocating events or sustained exposure to moral pain, which erodes over time the moral moorings of an individual. It can result from perpetration or betrayal. In the former instance, perpetration, an individual perceives themselves to have perpetrated a grave moral transgression by omission or commission, either because they have not prevented a morally transgressive event or participated in such action. In the latter, the betrayal, the individual, as Shea put it in 2002, perceives a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. The importance of this duality cannot be overestimated, but the betrayal-based causation or correlation between has been receiving relatively little attention. Much research on moral injury in members of the armed forces or veterans, its causes and the search for remedies has been focusing on the perpetration. This results in a focus on the individual who is cast as the bearer of the responsibility for being morally injured. Something is wrong with the person, and that needs repair, as some conceive it, or fixing, in quotation marks. Individuals do need healing, although this may not necessarily be best achieved by the prevalent method of psychological therapy. Quite apart from the need to ask what the repaired state looks like, it would, however, be wrong to assume that a remedy can be found by focusing on the injury alone. Injuries are usually caused by external factors too, which forces us to explore a much bigger picture. Here we thus need to acknowledge with Shea that a person can be morally injured because they feel betrayed in a high-stakes situation by a legitimate authority. The COVID-19 pandemic has certainly created such high-stakes situations aplenty for governments, in workplaces, and for societies in general around the globe. In the workplace, that authority is likely to rest with organizational and management structures, but ultimately the government has direct relevance to the public sector and sets policy parameters for the private sector and citizens. An act or the perception of betrayal presupposes the prior existence of trust and confidence. Although trust and confidence are often used interchangeably, both imply reliance on something or someone and are future-oriented, they are not entirely synonymous. It is worth highlighting a key distinction a Canadian defense research team has made. Recognizing the considerable overlap of the two concepts, they linked confidence to probability assessments of future actions or events based on prior experience, with an emphasis on cognition, and trust, on the other hand, to a much wider range of factors, including emotions and belief, and crucially, risk of potential loss or threat. Here then, we have a link to the essence of betrayal-based moral injury. In a crisis or high-stakes situation, trust in a legitimate authority is crucial. Initially, citizens, whether in a private or professional capacity, are likely to look to government for leadership and security, even if that means overriding potential lack of trust or confidence. Confidence in the future behavior can only grow with the experience of reliable support. If this is repeatedly failing to materialize, confidence wanes and eventually trust is undermined. For the individual, the challenges of risk management and having to make morally defensible decisions are, however, not going away. So in the absence of confidence or trust in the legitimate authority, the individual is thrown back onto their own judgment. The result may be a double effect causing moral injury because the individual cannot make what they consider morally right decisions, and the individual is potentially put in further jeopardy by the unavailability of trustworthy decision criteria. It is likely that we will need to live with the virus for some considerable time, and that future may be even more challenging than the recent past. Living under and emerging from government-imposed lockdown has been and is demanding ethically difficult choices of every member of society, even more those responsible for dependents, many of whom are vulnerable. The virus is not the great leveler. Those who went into the crisis already in a precarious socioeconomic position may have confronted especially stark choices between protecting the health of self and others, and sustaining life with such basic necessities as food and shelter. Here again, one morally right choice carries the risk of inflicting a moral wrong. The exorbitant increase of food bank use in the UK and the rise of incidents of domestic violence speak for themselves. Citizens, even those who are under great or have been under great pressure at home, have chosen to live by rules which clearly demanded great sacrifices of them. If their trust is repeatedly and increasingly severely undermined, for example, by the repeated failure to deliver on targets for testing, or now track and tracing, test and tracing, their compliance is already in jeopardy. If a government then effectively declares that rules do not apply to those who have contributed to devising them, as over the Dominic Cummings case here in the UK again, not only does this risk completely losing the trust of the public and the willingness to comply, but also inflicting a sense of betrayal. Will more individual responsibility for weighing up risks and making a right choice, as we are now seeing the transition to going from into this sort of easing of the lockdown, increase or decrease the likelihood of moral pain or even injury? It is essential to avoid fostering a victim culture. Instead, the aim of recognizing such risks can be to enable agency of citizens in the private and public sphere in a constructive and inclusive manner that is conducive to the establishment of what Galton calls positive peace. Otherwise, we risk a future with even greater social cleavages. Fred Alford, Professor Emeritus at Maryland, his observations lead to an apt conclusion. Already in 2016, he saw plentiful reasons why some US citizens might be morally injured because they experience on a daily basis acts that, quote, shatter moral and ethical expectations about fairness, the value of life, and the expectation that others will tell the truth, unquote. Such acts might be widespread in social and political life, he observed, leading to moral injury being commonplace, but he argued that is not good because, and he says, the lives of the morally injured manifest in chronic sadness and despair, overlaying a rage that occasionally becomes dramatic. I suggest that we are currently seeing this played out amongst Black citizens in the US and BAME citizens in the UK, who are disproportionately represented, especially healthcare professionals, amongst those who have died from COVID-19. In both societies, we see what may be a confluence of multiple causes, both underlying and proximate, of moral injury, reaching a tipping point over the killing of George Floyd. It is but one example, which should alert us to the need to understand and seek to prevent or remedy the causes of moral injury in societies across the globe as one aspect of our response to the shock of COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. If I can invite people to put questions in the Q&A, if you have questions, we have a few minutes for questions on this section of the panel before we move on to the next section. So please do post up anything that you want to ask in the Q&A, and we can put it to Andrea to address now. Just while we're waiting for that, I wonder, Andrea, if I can ask you a quick question. It was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. I wondered you made the link to the panel yesterday on ethics and solidarity, and it made me wonder to what extent is moral injury affected by or connected to solidarity. So does the question of whether or not there's cohesion among those making the decisions impact on whether or not moral injury results? And does this, if that's the assumption, how does that impact on kind of contestation and scrutiny, I guess? And I'm thinking about, Keir Starmer's challenge to Boris Johnson in the House of Commons the other day, which he put down as being unhelpful, and Keir Starmer maintained it was scrutiny. Does the need for solidarity undermine the need for contestation, if you like? And then I have a question, maybe if I can just ask the question that's come in as well, so that you make sure to get to that, because yeah, that's mine later if you want. So we have one question, which is, what are good mechanisms to measure the extent of moral injury?
That's a really important question, and it's a really difficult question to ask in the context of particularly civilian society, because you can potentially get into quite woolly territory. I would start with the symptoms. I would start with the observations that have been made over and over, that people veterans and members of the armed forces who have suffered from moral injury feel a great deal of shame about something they have done. That is slight. They can also feel guilt, but shame is a more prevalent manifestation of it. And I don't think it's easy to quantify, because one of the key problems is if you feel ashamed, then you're less likely to come forward even than if you feel guilty. Because by feeling shame, you end up excluding yourself from society. So it's really the people around you who are likely to be more able to see, is from the research with the military, you can observe that people around you who observe you are more likely to see that there's something going on, there's something wrong. In wider society, I do wonder whether, if we wanted to really try to get some sort of metric, whether looking at how people talk about why they, for example, voted for just change over the whole Brexit referendum, whether, and that has been linked to people feeling excluded, people who have strongly supported more nationalistic leaders feel excluded from what they see as a liberal dominated environment. And that is, in a sense, a form of moral injury, which you could start to probe. If you ask questions that are asking about symptoms we know are associated with moral injury in veterans, you could start testing whether you get a reasonably statistically significant set of results by big opinion public surveys, where you examine to what degree people have been excluded or felt somehow silenced and have not been participating in public discourse, and have found that their whole moral compass was being trampled on, which may lead to some uncomfortable, for particularly for liberals, for some uncomfortable conclusions, because what is considered to be a moral issue for very conservative and very liberal people can be poles apart. But therein also lies not only the challenge, but also an opportunity, I think. So apologies for a slightly woolly answer, but in a societal context, because there isn't really very much research yet, this is one, what I'm talking about is one of the calls for action, so that we might start coming up with a framework which allows us to establish a bit more of a metric on the back of what we already know.
Okay, thank you. We've got 3 great questions come in, so I'm gonna put them all and then perhaps ask you to address as much of it as you can in the last 5 minutes before we move on to the next section. So the first question is, can you please explain how shame and guilt differ, perhaps with an example? The next question, as you said, there are some grey areas in determining moral injury, such as protesters who doubt the legitimacy of COVID as a threat, feeling oppressed. Who would determine what is and isn't moral injury? And then finally, positive outcomes, a sort of observation that positive outcomes from community disadvantage, such as can lead to communities sharing and organising. So negative outcomes could be anger, which can be internalized or externalized. And likewise, on a personal level, a feeling of moral injury can be very motivating. And that question is from Rosemary Berry, who's researching Syrian NGOs. So Andrea, if I can just put those back to you to tackle before we move on. There'll be an opportunity as well to ask more sort of general questions at the end. We can come back to this then. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I've got 4 minutes for 3 great questions, and great in every sense of the word, so they're all quite difficult. So shame is often related to having transgressed one's own moral framework, having betrayed by one's actions or inactions moral standards to which one would have hoped to live up. Guilt, on the other hand, is a transgression of externally imposed, I mean, this is a very crude distinction, but of externally imposed norms of behavior. So you may feel shameful about having betrayed standards which you and your social grouping strongly believe in. They may also be professional standards, and therefore you don't really want to talk about this, whereas feeling guilty is by having feeling that you've breached a law. so there are, the dynamics are slightly different. I do apologize, I've got 3 minutes to do the other two questions. I will move on to this. So the colloquially called conspiracy theories, the protest about COVID-19 lockdown, and it's all sort of a big way of suppressing public freedoms. This is what I meant when we might find some uncomfortable answers. There is some really good, fairly old now, research on looking at what very conservative people and very liberal people consider to be moral issues. Moral issues can be located in the social justice, care, harm bracket, fairness, inclusion. So there are sort of two categories there. Or they can be located within the concepts of authority, strongly believing in authority, or community and loyalty to the community, or in fact, purity and sanctity through a religious route. Now, all of these are moral frameworks. For the people who hold these values, these are moral frameworks. And because so my definition of moral injury would have to be within those frameworks. So if your own framework, moral framework, which someone else might, dispute, but if that's injured or is somehow dislocated, then you are morally injured. How we move on from this is then the challenge. How we move on from a wide range of causes of moral injury and injuries inflicted on different moral frameworks, that's where both the difficulty, but also for me, the potential for future renewal of social interaction and social cohesion can lie. This speaks slightly to the solidarity question that Rachel asked at the start. What is important, and I'm shamelessly liberal here, and I don't regret it for one moment. What I think is really important is that we don't support community cohesion and solidarity, which is exclusionary. So cohesion and the ability to help one's own community bought at the price of exclusion or vilification of other communities is not conducive to the kind of positive peace where structural conditions apply, where everyone can try to live up to their potential. So there is, and yesterday's panel discussed that at great length. There's some serious traps in there as well. Last point, positive outcomes of moral injury and community disadvantage. Absolutely. And my aim would be in this discussion to think about how moral injury can be helpful for the creation of agency. As I said, what I personally think we need to avoid in triggering this discourse is to reinforce a culture of victimization. That's not helpful, and it's likely to fuel the social cleavages that we already have. But trying to see this as a vehicle for agency is both a way of healing from moral injury and trying to create something good from it. There are veterans organizations in the US. There's one veterans organization where veterans who have been physically injured who have been mentally injured or morally injured have train assistance dogs for veterans who are physically injured. That, I think, is a hugely creative way of dealing with the question of so where do we go with moral injury? And it's a positive contribution, which also transcends and can be applied to civilian context. So it's not an exclusionary way of going about it. But there is, on these questions, they are really important questions. There's a lot more thinking and work to be done, where we can explore, hopefully, frameworks within which research can be generated that also puts a bit more sort of hard facts behind philosophical and theoretical discussions. So I'm afraid I've now overrun by 2 minutes, so I shall now wind my neck in and hand over to Rachel first and thank you very much for dealing with all the questions.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, I think we should move on to our next panel. So if I can ask David Whetham, Marina and Martin to introduce yourselves and upload. I believe you have a presentation to upload, so please go ahead.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about our work this morning. I'll start by very briefly introducing the team. First of all, before joining King's as Professor in Conflict, Health and Military Medicine, Martin was the Surgeon General of the UK Armed Forces and has considerable experience of leading medical teams in challenging environments. Martin will introduce the scope of military medical ethics, as well as the pedagogical research that went into developing our new tools. Second member of our team today is Dr. Marina Miron. She's a postdoc research fellow at the King's Centre for Military Ethics. She has a PhD in military strategy from the UNSW Canberra and has been leading on the centre's training projects with the Colombian Armed Forces since early 2019. Marina will talk about the impact of the work we've been doing there and the methodology of expanding our materials. Not here today, but Dr. Mohammed Mitwali has been contributing particularly on the Arabic language and cultural translation of our materials. And finally, I'm Professor David Whetham. I'm based at the UK Defence Academy in Shrivenham, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Military Ethics. I'll start by putting the slides up and explaining why we need ethics education for the military at all. So that's our team. So before talking about the medical side of our work, I need to provide some context. So this is about the need for the tools. The range of ethical challenges for military personnel in the 21st century is immense, even in the more traditional type of military operations, while the nature of the contemporary operating environment poses unique levels of physical and mental stress due to blurred front lines and a constant threat to life due to a lack of safe zones. In many missions, the most demanding leadership is often exercised at very low levels of the chain of command, invariably by those who have received the smallest investment in career development terms to date, but are still expected to make life and death decisions that can affect a huge number of people. Ethics training has been shown to reduce actual unethical behavior in conflict situations. And as we've already heard from Andrea this morning, there's emerging evidence that it can also reduce incidences of post-traumatic stress and possibly moral injury as well. People who have been equipped with the tools to make the best decision at the time may be able to deal with those decisions better in the long term. Published evidence convincingly demonstrates that group-based ethics training programs can positively influence soldiers' behaviors and attitudes, for example, towards the treatment of non-competence. Normalizing the discussion of ethical challenges can change attitudes and influence behavior. But in high-tempo, busy environments, how do you do this? How do you make non-specialists comfortable discussing a subject that often doesn't lend itself to black and white, right and wrong answers? In order to provide a cost-effective, easy and military-focused solution, the KCL Centre for Military Ethics, based at the UK Defence Academy, designed a deck of military ethics education playing cards, which enable group discussion of ethical issues arising in military settings, anywhere from barracks to high-tempo operations. Consisting of 52 ethical challenges, which can be thematically connected, the playing cards can be used irrespective of rank, location, or availability of a classroom. They're now in their second revised edition, having been tested and refined in multiple units and armed forces around the world. The cards can be used as a standalone tool, but for those that wish to do more, they also form part of an integrated learning experience. Through a unique QR code on the back of each card, an example on the screen now, users can use their own mobile phones to link directly through to further material on the centre website, including case studies, further reading, and where appropriate, direct answers to the challenges in the form of videos contributed by serving personnel, meaning that users of the cards can actually hear what their peers think about different challenges. The same site that hosts this extra material also hosts courses in military ethics, from short introductions to various aspects of military ethics, through to comprehensive 18-week courses that can be integrated into general institutional curricula. Many thousands of the cards are already being used by NATO states and their allies, from Belgrade to Bogota, and they are already available and being used in English, French, Spanish, Turkish, Serbian, and Arabic. As low-cost, high-impact solutions go, this is a disruptive technology that has already proven itself to be successful with military personnel from many countries. It's a non-threatening, familiar, and an accessible way to get people to engage with discussions about military ethics and the right thing to do, while providing practical and relatable answers that make sense to all professional military personnel, regardless of their origin. For an example of their impact, I'm going to hand over to Marina to talk about the work in Colombia.
Thank you, David. I would like to talk about our specific case study, which is Colombia. It has been a very important case study for us, given the fact that despite the peace accords of November 2016, the long war in Colombia is still far from being over. So it was important to test this course in an environment where military forces are still used. At first, we started in Colombia in 2017, where the digital course has been implemented at the War College. The digital course was supplemented with a classroom element, and the Center for Military Ethics has brought Professor Martin Cook, who is a professor of professional military ethics, to teach the Colombian teachers, to teach the senior officers at the War College. However, at that time, we couldn't measure our impact, given the fact that we didn't have an ethical approval from the armed forces. Yet, good feedback from the officers has spread the word, and over the years, we have been able to obtain an approval from the General of the Army to expand the course to other educational institutions within the military, specifically the Army. Given the ongoing scandals regarding human rights abuses and corruption, especially in the Army aviation, this military ethics course has been seen to be essential to educate also junior officers, that is, second lieutenant to major. At present, we're running this course at the Center for Military Education, which belongs to the Colombian Army. Having obtained the ethical approval to run surveys, now we can measure the effectiveness of the course. And after 2 iterations, we have been able to establish that 100% of the officers who have taken the course have found it very useful and asked us to expand it to other institutions. So we are in progress right now to cover a very broad spectrum of the institutions belonging both to the Army, to the Air Force, and Navy. Also, we have seen that ethical conduct has been improved because this course, and especially the digital cards that it offered, have been used in combat environments. Seeing the success, we have decided to implement other topics which are no less important, that is medical military ethics.
So for an explanation of what we mean by military medical ethics, I'm going to hand over to Martin.
So military medical ethics can be considered as a discrete subset of both military ethics and medical ethics. This is the conundrum of duality of profession for military medical personnel, both to the profession of the military and also to their healthcare profession. covering doctors, nurses, and allied health professions. Indeed, whilst they can change their employer from the Ministry of Defence, they will lose their employment if they're struck off for professional misconduct by their professional body due to failure to comply with professional ethics. So military medical ethics is based on the ethical standards of the various healthcare professions that the individual belongs to, but reinforced by international humanitarian law, and specifically from provisions within the Geneva Conventions. And these can be grouped into the professional duties of healthcare professionals, the primacy of duty towards the patient, and the rules surrounding the protection of patients and healthcare personnel, and indeed medical installations. In the UK, there are specific sections in a variety of sources of military doctrine, covering the law of armed conflict, medical doctrine, military law, as well as shown on this slide, professional guidance provided by the British Medical Association. And from an international perspective, as a result of the misuse of military capability against healthcare institutions, a consensus statement was developed that I show on the slide titled Ethical Principles of Healthcare in Times of Armed Conflict and Other Emergencies, with a particular emphasis on trying to ensure that military medical personnel serving in formal armed forces are aware of their responsibilities and duties. So with that as a background, I'll hand back over to Marina to talk about the development of the methodology of the military medical ethics playing cards.
Thank you, Martin. So with the support from the King's Conflict and Health Research Group, the research was undertaken to determine ethical training and educational needs of both medical and military professionals, as well as humanitarian actors working in conflict or humanitarian crisis environments, which helped us to identify gaps in current provision. This led us to undertake extensive literature reviews, as well as semi-structured anonymized interviews with healthcare workers who are familiar with crisis situations. And this would include also international military medical personnel, personnel from international NGOs, UNHRC, IRC, WHO, ICRC, and Doctors Without Borders, as well as medical personnel from the Jordanian Armed Forces and Jordanian-based NGOs. This research helped us uncover a range of profound ethical challenges that these health workers face in crisis situation, and the real gap in training and preparation and material to support decision-making in difficult and challenging environments. Based on that research, we developed questions from across the broad area of humanitarian crisis ethics. Each issue was matched to a different playing card, just like the non-medical version of the military ethics playing cards. The decks would be available to anybody, both in their physical and digital form, and they would help to prompt informal discussions about the ethical challenges faced in humanitarian crisis environments. I would like to name a few examples of the questions. How does one apply triage when lack of resources mean people can be saved today but are likely to die tomorrow from complications? Or what cultural or religious concerns should you try and accommodate when faced with life and death decisions? As with a military ethics deck of cards, groups of questions are thematically linked, so impromptu or pre-planned supported discussions can be quickly developed using open access materials via the QR web links that David has pointed out earlier. At the moment, we have the app available both in English and Arabic, so that the tool can be used all across the MENA region. However, we are planning on expanding the offering in regards to languages and regions in the near future. Thank you.
So if we go to the next slide, the military medical ethics playing cards have now been used by a number of military medical educators, and found to be a very helpful way of facilitating group discussion. This slide shows me teaching a session on military medical ethics at the Kofi Annan Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. And this shows the value of also developing a fully integrated educational package that supports the use of the playing cards as a resource, but is designed to facilitate discussion and development of attitudes as an educational outcome. And this is particularly helpful in multinational and multidisciplinary settings. However, the physical cards have some constraints compared to the use of electronic learning resources. And so David will now pick up how the concept of the cards and the website has been developed into an app for use by students and educators.
Thank you, Martin. So we realized through the type of beta testing that Martin's just been talking about that we could make the cards even more accessible if they were available as a self-contained app that could be downloaded and used by anyone wherever they are. So we determined that with some clever design, it was possible to keep the familiarity and structure of the playing cards, even though it was in a different format. The app format also has a number of profound advantages over the printed material. So firstly, because the app is designed to refresh whenever it is launched, it can pull through updates every time it's opened with a live internet connection, making it a fantastic vehicle for getting up-to-date information and guidance to the people that need it. Secondly, if you don't have a live internet link, then the app itself is still a self-contained tool with all the supporting materials, guidance, and suggestions for how to use the materials all in one place. The app doesn't fall foul of any local regulations that might be in place, banning gambling in military establishments as well. And finally, unlike the production costs associated with the cards, the app is completely free to distribute. So just like the cards, and as you can see on the screen now, the aim is to have everything on the app available in both English and Arabic, so it can be used across the MENA region. So how do you access this? Well, the last round of beta testing with focus groups had to be suspended when the COVID-19 pandemic began. Therefore, rather than wait until this can be resumed, we've decided to launch it now and ask for feedback directly from the military medical community so we can complete the beta testing and launch it in its final form as soon as possible. Therefore, it goes live to anyone who wishes to download it today. You can access the app either by using the link here on the screen, or you can find the link in the tweets today that are going out from the lecture series and also from the Center for Military Ethics, which is at KCL Mil Ethics. If you follow the link, it takes you to a test flight app through which you can download the military medical app. This provides a vehicle for the app developer team to respond to user feedback and make any amendments to the software that may be required. It also gives us an opportunity for feedback from medical practitioners on the content of the cards. And we hope that users will volunteer material that, if judged appropriate, can then be added to the resources to help the wider community. An Android version of the app is also ready and will be released imminently. So, realizing that there is a great deal of commonality in the issues being faced by civilian medics today, dealing with the COVID pandemic, we have received startup funding from the King's Policy Institute to develop an ethical medicine in crisis version of the medical app as well. The COVID-19 pandemic has put healthcare professionals across the world in an unprecedented situation, having to make harrowing decisions and work under extreme pressures. Decisions have included the allocation of scarce resources to equally needy patients, the balancing of clinician, physical and mental healthcare needs with those of patients, and how to provide care for all severely unwell patients with constrained or inadequate resources. This has been compared to triage in a military situation. As we've already seen in the past 3 months, changing established triage procedures or palliative care protocols due to extreme situations can have considerable emotional implications for both clinicians, patients, and relatives. A lack of preparation for this may also contribute to the experience of moral injury or mental health problems amongst medical personnel. Therefore, there is a need to support ethical decision-making for the medics being placed in this situation, but also to provide a vehicle for helping them to talk through the different challenges as part of a care team. So we will apply the same methodology as with the creation of the topics and questions on the military cards, finding out what the issues at the front line really are. Where appropriate guidance exists from the national professional bodies, the app can draw on it directly to provide healthcare professionals with supporting material, providing the answers as well as posing the questions. And as you can see at the bottom of each card, there's a Learn More tab, and this is where the additional information to actually help people find the answers can be found. I'm going to hand over to Martin now for how this will actually be developed further.
So building on the experience of developing the military medical ethics cards, we have recognized the importance of integrating the technical aspects of development with oversight by a team of experts in both clinical medicine and medical ethics. So we'll be setting up a clinical review board of around 15 people, which will provide oversight of the process for the selection of topics and scenarios for the cards and the app, and also help us with the reviewing of the Learn More narratives that will provide guidance and references to assist discussion. We have also recognized the value of demonstrating the impact of the cards and app through formally designing the educational pathways for the use of resources. So we want to prospectively run some educational experimentation, looking at different settings in which the cards and the apps might be suitable to support education. And as this develops further, we want to create some online educational material built around presentations, interviews, and guided reading. So this really is about taking what has been learnt through the development of the military ethics cards, through the military medical ethics cards, and now applying it to a much wider target audience. And the reason for it is that we've already demonstrated, I think, through our presentation, the importance of getting this area right. Firstly, and most importantly, to improve clinical decision-making for patients. But the organisation of healthcare requires decision-making at the organisational level. And so we want to make sure that we've included those aspects of educational policy making as part of management and leadership at the organisational level. And the final aspect of this, of course, is the way in which teaching in ethics can support the protection of the mental health of healthcare workers, both in terms of psychiatric injury, but also in terms of moral injury. So having had some pump priming grant support, we're now in the process of looking at how we can get some sustainable grant funding to actually set this up as a project titled Ethical Medicine in Crisis. So I think that completes our presentation as a team, and then I'll hand back over to David to manage questions.
Thank you very much, Martin. I can see we've got the first question there. In terms of ethical education, apart from the cards, do you use other types of simulations, for example, real-time place simulations or educational games or apps, so that personnel get a virtual but almost real experience on how to deal with the crisis or ethical dilemmas? So yes, the more realistic the scenarios that you can develop, the better for different types of situation. So absolutely. So there's always a debate as to whether or not you should use actual real life examples that have already been experienced or fictionalized ones that don't carry with them additional baggage, but I find using a mixture of them both can be extremely effective. Martin, how does this work in a medical environment?
Sure. So the ethical aspects of the provision of clinical and organisational medicine should be covered as a routine part of any form of educational activity. So in essence, what we are seeking to do is create an educational resource that can be incorporated by other educators into their ethics teaching at whatever stage in the professional development of healthcare personnel they're involved in. So this is very much part of a program of education that, again, we would hope would be available as a public good, but would be robustly supported by research, so that anybody using it had complete confidence in the material that we produce. Thanks, David.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions lurking there, or whether we shall take, if we have time at the very end, we might be able to come back, but it probably makes sense to hand over to Rachel now.
Things, I think. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, David. So we're moving on now to the third section of our sort of tour this morning, over a range of different topics, all connected to the research theme we're all part of law, society, and culture. So Maria and I are going to talk about the research and networking, challenges of research and networking under physical distancing rules. So as we all know, and as we've heard, COVID has had an enormous impact on all of our lives, and has changed them in multiple ways. And as we also know, the impact has been very uneven, and the experience very different across our communities, especially as it's exposed and in some cases exacerbated inequalities, vulnerabilities, and exclusions, and most particularly along lines of race and gender. But for some, at least, it's also opened up new opportunities. So we wanted to talk, as well as talking about some of the challenges, talk about some of the opportunities for research, as new questions and approaches to research have emerged, both for engagement and for networking as well. So Maria and I are going to talk about some of those challenges and opportunities, and I'll focus on the practical, personal, and ethical challenges, and Maria on the more substantive legal and ethical dimensions of research on the pandemic and our responses to it. So first of all, just by way of introduction, I'm Rachel Kerr, and I'm a reader in international relations and contemporary war in the Department of War Studies. And I co-convened the War Crimes Research Group with Professor James Gow, which is part of the Law, Society and Culture theme. Dr Maria Varaki is a lecturer in international law in the Department of War Studies as well, and she also convenes the War Crimes Research Group with us, and particularly the seminar series. So we'll each speak for 7 to 10 minutes each, and then open up to questions. So do please feel free to put your questions up as we're talking, and also if you have questions relating to the first 2 sessions this morning as well, we can gather all of those together at the end too and pick them up. So what are the challenges and opportunities? We know a lot about the challenges, and I wanted to talk about sort of 3 dimensions of it: personal challenges, practical challenges, and ethical challenges. So on the personal front, we know that we all, as researchers at all stages of our careers, are dealing with changed personal circumstances. So some of us are juggling caring responsibilities, in some cases struggling with homeschooling. We're dealing with higher levels of stress and anxiety, in some cases grief and concern about loved ones, as well as a broader anxiety about the situation that we're in that impacts all of us. We're also confined to home. So for some, finding quiet spaces to work can be a challenge, and also obviously being able to access resources for research, so being able to access libraries, archival repositories, research data can be a challenge. In addition to that, particular constraints on research are imposed by the travel restrictions and social distancing rules that we're all living under, meaning that many projects are essentially on hold. So, for example, we have two sets of workshops that were supposed to go ahead in Sarajevo with our project partners there in May and June that have had to be postponed. Many other project meetings and workshops and conferences have been cancelled or postponed as a result of all of this as well. For researchers who are linked to grants, it's created considerable uncertainty about whether or not contracts might be able to be extended to cover a period of inactivity and what to do in the meantime. For PhD students, it creates particular sets of anxieties about whether the project that they set out to do is going to be still viable, especially for those who were just about to embark on field work or embark on a prolonged period in the archives. They're having to think carefully about contingencies and about how their research might be managed in this new environment, and potentially about a change of direction, which can be incredibly unsettling at any stage of the research journey. The financial impact of COVID on research and development is also likely to reduce opportunities for research that's not directly relevant to it. So there are questions about what will happen with UKRI budgets, not only in relation to whether or not they can provide costed extensions, but also what the grant programs are going to look like going forward. Questions about the future of schemes like the big scheme of the Global Challenges Research Fund, and other industry and government collaborations and partnerships in a world where there are significant financial constraints, which are likely to be the case for some years to come. Travel restrictions and social distancing, as I've mentioned, also have had a huge impact and have meant that many opportunities for networking, dissemination, and engagement with other researchers have been curtailed. So I guess in our field, the first big casualty, the first big shock was the cancellation of the ISA in March, and numerous other events have been cancelled, falling like dominoes after that. Although much has been able to go online, and this conference, the School of Security Studies Research Conference, is a good example of that. It has, in that way, it has also opened up some opportunities. In particular, the move online has opened up opportunities for more people to participate from more places in the world. A final sort of set of challenges are around, I think, the term as an ethical dimension to all of this, and the demands on our time. So all of these competing demands that we have, the energy and attention also raises these ethical dilemmas about what to do and where to focus. So should we prioritize home and family, friends and community, commitments to research, commitments to our funders, commitments to research staff and students, commitments to partners in research projects, our commitments to supporting students and to transforming education, and our commitments to serving society in the King's terminology, so our wider role. How do we balance all of those, and where do we make the decisions about which priorities have to focus on? Another question around whether we should shift our focus. So to what extent should we be shifting our research focus to the challenges and questions that are raised by the response to the pandemic in particular, especially where it's highlighted existing fault lines of global and domestic inequalities? This can also create some anxiety about essentially jumping on bandwagons, and concerns that it leaves exposed some problems which haven't gone away. So for example, research partners in Bosnia have expressed quite a lot of concern about what will happen to funding to their initiatives in peace building and reconciliation, where the record shows that whenever global shocks like this come along, funding is diverted to other areas. So they're concerned about the diversion to health security, with little recognition maybe of the link between those areas and the need to continue to focus on the core areas of peace building and reconciliation that underpin their work. It requires a great deal of imagination and flexibility to adapt to the changed circumstances as well. And I would say on the sort of side of optimism, that again, the partners that we work with have shown a great deal of imagination and adaptability to respond to this new environment, to move collections online. So one of the partners that we work with is the Historical Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they quickly moved their collections online. And I wanted to just read out a quote from one of the artists whose work was exhibited as part of this new online exhibition, which really, I think, captures this dilemma of wanting to respond to the current crisis, but at the same time wanting to respond in a way that's meaningful and that's linked to expertise and to the work that you're already doing and to your own personal ideas about it, rather than being in a sense performative. So Denis Haracic is a Bosnian artist, says that his work is an inner struggle between evident production obligations created by the fertile ground for reaction art generated by the coronavirus pandemic and an idea of artistic expression free from global trends or demand. Says that although his work was ultimately meant to be a response to the global situation we're all experiencing at this moment, I realized soon enough that the sheer expectation of such work done by artists is one demand that seems to go back to a whole culture of a capitalistic fueled art market. At times, it almost feels like a set-up competition of who has the fastest and most attractive reaction to a certain global affair. And I think we can see that resonance in thinking about research and who has the sort of fastest and most attractive response to the current crisis. I want to end by talking a little bit about opportunities. Let's try and end on an optimistic note. Of course, it's provided opportunities also, and perhaps the most important is an ethical obligation and the ethical dimension of this, to pursue research questions that have arisen that will have the most impact on the big issues of inequality and human rights that have been starkly demonstrated by this crisis. It's also provided opportunities to shift the way we work and to shift the culture in which we work, from one of intense competition, perhaps to one more focused on cooperation and to value collegiality. It allows us to include more people. It can be more inclusive. Events like this that are online can include people without having to navigate through the vagaries of the UK visa system in order to bring people to speak. So it has a potential advantage there in expanding our global conversations as well. And perhaps can make us kinder and more considerate of one another as we are having windows into people's personal circumstances. So we're seeing people's homes, their kids and dogs on Teams and Zoom calls, unless that's just mine. And we open emails and meetings with genuine entreaties to be safe and well, and inquiries after our colleagues and our students' well-being. Opportunities have been opened up by social media that have also allowed for greater engagement and innovative ways of collaborating and supporting one another, like this one. So I'm going to stop there on this more optimistic note, I hope, and hand over to Maria to talk maybe a bit more about the more substantive dimensions of the response. Thank you. Maria.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you all. It's my great pleasure to participate in this panel. Well, I will try to cover the more optimistic component of this discussion regarding research, especially from an international legal perspective. And I have to say first, I would like to a little bit contextualize and to say that this pandemic, the COVID-19, erupted in a period where already, at least in the international legal scholarship, we're talking about the backlash against multinationalism, against the liberal legal order, the way it was built after the end of World War II, and especially particularly after the end of Cold War, and also this rise of populism and nativism. And when the pandemic erupted, we saw two trends, at least in the public debate. We saw one trend, a call for further cooperation in order, via shared responsibility to deal with this pandemic. And on the other hand, we saw a trend, a return back to the hardcore nativism and sovereignism. And we couldn't have a more clear example, of the closed borders and the adoption, of unilateral measures. So we were talking all the time about the crisis. And I have to say that there was an iconic article a couple of years ago speaking that international law thrives in times of crisis, that we international lawyers, we want crisis in order to justify our existence. Otherwise, what's the point, of international law? However, very recently I read that the word crisis in Chinese entails both the component of danger, but also the component of opportunity. So here I would like to talk about a little bit about to enlighten, to illuminate this component of opportunity and what threats in legal research, but not very pure legalistic research, in a more multidisciplinary research we can identify, where we can see, a connection between international law, international relations or politics, and international ethics, something that the previous speakers touched upon that. So I would like to sketch out here three threads, at least the way I have identified. The first one is that since the COVID pandemic erupted, we talk a lot about responsibility. We talk a lot about the responsibility, and there is a discussion, scholarly discussion, and not only about the various aspects of responsibility, whether it is of the international organizations such as the WHO, the World Health Organization, or the responsibility of particular states, such as China, but not only China, equally the responsibility of United States when they decided to withdraw their payments to the WHO, but also the responsibility of individual leaders. So one thread of research, and maybe something that it will become quite fashionably, but I would say that we see it very, very often, is this focus on responsibility / legal accountability. Again, we want someone to blame, we need accountability, we want to prove our existence. I want to say something that Rachel touched upon, that there is for sure an anxiety and pressure upon scholars to produce something related to COVID. Whether you want to secure a grant, or you want to be visible with a post, or you want to, in order to justify your existence, there is pressure and anxiety that you have to change your research focus in order to touch also upon COVID. And this is something that we should always keep in mind, to what extent that something that Rachel talked extensively about affects our research. So as I said before, the first thread is about responsibility of international organizations, responsibility of particular states, responsibility of particular individuals. How did they deal? How did they react? What is their legal accountability, if any? What kind of duty to act they had, and what are the legal implications, of the action or if inaction of these various actors, at least in the legal domain. The second thread of research, the second theme of research, which I particularly find more interesting, I have to say, deals with this binary, something that we experienced almost 2 decades ago with the so-called war on terror between liberties and human rights, the right of liberty versus the right versus other human rights, in our particular situation, public health, public interest, the public interest of public health. And here one could identify massive production already of very highly sophisticated scholarship that deals with the limits of human rights protection in times of emergency, whether we have a legalistic and official acknowledgement of a de facto state of emergency, de jure state of emergency, excuse me, something that we have seen in various countries, or a de facto state of emergency, something that we experience in most countries all over the world. And there again, there is a massive discussion of how far can we allow a limitation to our other rights, like the right to privacy, the right to assembly, the right to freedom of expression in times of emergency, and to what extent various regimes, something that we talked briefly mentioned before about this rise of populism and nativism and nationalism, they have exploited this pandemic in order to the detriment of the protection of human rights and basic principles. Here one can easily mention, it sounds a little bit Eurocentric, but I think Hungary is a very characteristic example, you know, of a de jure state of emergency compared to other countries such as France, for example. But also we have seen the situation in Israel very clearly, that I'm going to mention a little bit more, and in many other countries. I think the biggest fear and concern among international legal scholars who deal with the issue of human rights in times of emergency is to what extent the invocation of public health can contribute into a normalization of a state of emergency, where we are going to have emergency legislation inside normal, regular legislation. Within this context, within this second theme of human rights in times of emergency, I think a particular sub-theme is the issue of artificial intelligence and surveillance programs. We have seen that with several applications in South Korea, in Singapore, but most extensively in Israel, where in the context, you know, of protection of public health, we had authorities that they had massive access into public into private data, and they use, even in Israel, counter-terrorism legislation in order to track down potential virus patients and to find who they contacted with and what they did. And that really raised a high alarm among legal scholars about the extent and how different states, depending on their background, their particular states that they have a trend, an inclination towards authoritarianism, can consolidate a so-called permanent state of emergency in the name of public health. I'm not here to say that we didn't have a problem of public health, of course, and I'm not saying, you know, that human rights are not limited. We have some human rights that you cannot derogate even in times of emergencies, but of course we have to acknowledge that we live in an unprecedented era where we should be always alert about the extent of intrusion into our private life. So technology, artificial intelligence, surveillance mechanisms, it was something, you know, that it is at the top of the research list of many legal scholars. The third theme I would like to talk a little bit more about here is, and that goes back, it's not pure international law, it's not legal scholarship. I think it bridges perfectly what has been discussed until now by the previous speakers. It's about leadership. It's about, we have seen a call for strong leadership or good leadership. I would add here of ethical leadership, what we mean about ethical leadership. And this is something, you know, that whether it's about medical ethics or it's about something else, we have seen how important is the decision making, how important is this exercise of judgment, and how important is the human agency, and what kind of leaders we want to have in positions in times of crisis, who they have to take decisions, and they have to take good decisions. I know now I open a massive discussion, but also ethical decisions, because we live in an era where there are many discussions about what is a common good. Already before, Martin talked a little bit about the concept of common good. Before we start this panel, I read a headline: should artificial intelligence be a common good? Should a vaccine against the pandemic be a common good? What kind of leaders who move beyond legal norms should have those traits that they will facilitate this understanding of vision of the common good, of the shared responsibility, of further cooperation, for this enemy, because we see also very much this usage of the words war and enemy. Having said that, I want to stop here because we need some time for Q&As. And I would like to say that there is massive discussion, as I say, about we live in a crisis and what this crisis is about. But we could all get some inspiration. I know it sounds very cliché by Camus and what he wrote in his famous fictionary book more than 50 years ago, that maybe the answer is decency. And I think the discussion we had in this panel about the global shocks and the relationship between these global shocks, leadership, decision-making has underneath, we can see a thread for a call for decency. Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Maria. When you're talking about normalization, it makes me think of, those discussions about whether we are in the new normal. Is this the new normal? And I was reading something this morning about saying we shouldn't really be going, we shouldn't think of this as the normal and we need to go back. Well, this is something different and we need to go back to normal. We need to think about how we move forward from this. And the kinds of things that you talk about offer perhaps opportunities for change. And then linking back to Andrea's talk this morning, bringing up sort of ideas of positive peace and social justice, and perhaps sort of connecting that to ideas of decency and kind of, I suppose, the ethical obligation that we have to create something different moving forward. So I can see that there are a few questions, I think, related to the previous discussion about medical ethics. So I don't know, David and Marina and Martin, do you want to take those as they're there? Do you want me to read them out?
Yeah, Rachel, I had a quick chat with David offline about this, and I'm quite happy to read them out. So because you've already chaired and taken my questions, I'm very happy to reciprocate. I get off lightly because we've only got 6 minutes left. Thank you very much for two absolutely excellent presentations at the end. I think you've both highlighted some really key issues. I liked the quote you had from, was it a Sarajevan colleague? About the issue, or artist rather, sorry, to talk about this race for the fastest response. When we were encouraged very quickly to start thinking about COVID, it did strike me that for me, it immediately brought up the question of a balance between wanting to help and find solutions and tackle problems and identifying the problems, but also not being ambulance chasing. So this race for the fastest response, I was quite worried about. Before I get to David, the questions to David's team, one brief question about particularly the implications of technology and the tension between technology, human rights, security, and privacy, and some countries having very different approaches that Maria raised. To what degree do you think has the global discourse and the discourse on globalization over some of the particularly worrisome countries, now, is that changing? Are we more alert to seeing, let's not mince our words, China as a greater or different threat than we used to? Or is this a danger to globalization, or is globalization still the answer? Where are you going with this, Maria?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea, for this question. Well, it's true that globalization had become, when we were talking last year before the pandemic erupted, everything was that it's globalization's fault. you know, all this rise that we have of populism, of nativism. Danny Roderick wrote about the hyper-globalization, that we went too fast, there were many people left behind, it's a matter, it's a problem of globalization. I would say that we are much more alert. Yes, we are much more alert during the last years about what happened, whether it was interference into elections of other countries or whether it was hacking. But I would try to be a little bit more moderate in that sense, you know, not to go to the other extreme. I think we need to realize that the technology is here, that we live in an extremely globalized world. The pandemic proved it more than anything else. And that's why I tried to link it with the third theme of research, which I think it's very much linked to all of you, you know, and that goes back to leadership and decision making. I mean, we have different calls. We have calls about further regulation. Of course, you know, whether we talk about the cyberspace or we talk about artificial intelligence or we talk about globalization. But then I think my response would be that we should go back to human agency and to see who makes all these decisions. And I know it sounds very basic and very cliche, and we go back all the way down. But at the end of the day, you know, we have to see who we vote for to be our leaders, you know, in order to make those decisions. Definitely, we are more alert. There are many pros and cons. It's a massive discussion about the interference.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is, of course, the opportunity there to rediscover humans and the role of the human, which sometimes has got lost in some of the discussion. So there's quite a lot of research work that still relates to concerns that we had before the big pandemic, but is now potentially looking different in a COVID-19 environment. So there is still hope for our research projects and maybe getting some funding for still critical questions. Now we're rapidly running out of time, so I will take both questions together and put them to David, Martin and Marina, and give you a minute and a half to answer them. So the first question is, how would you envisage the impact of the military medical ethics cards being measured? What effects or research questions are outstanding? And the second question, what are the critical criteria to make the right decision in the conflict situation? Order, in brackets, existing mission or operation versus ethics. The example case is COVID-19 has killed many of US soldiers. So those are our two last questions. And when you've finished answering them, to the extent possible in a minute, I will conclude the panel. So I don't know who would like to go first, David or Martin or Marina?
Martin,
I can take this first.
Yeah, okay, I'll pick up both. So the impact of any form of educational intervention is quite difficult to measure. And certainly that's one of the reasons why in developing the COVID cards, we wanted to put a educational methodology alongside it. But certainly for us, the greatest value, of course, is the number of people who'd use them. And by creating some space on the app, there is chance for feedback and other things. And that can be one way in which we can measure impact of these cards and the app. The second question touches on the balance of risk, really, between managing a military mission versus the risk of conducting the mission in a way that puts you at risk of catching COVID. And there's a very good session on Tuesday on the role of the military in the age of COVID-19. And there was discussion about the challenges the Ukrainians were facing about defending their country against the insurgents in the east of the country, which is pretty much impossible to fight war and also conduct social distancing under COVID circumstances. And indeed, we've also seen the challenges that navies have had in operating ships when there's a risk of a COVID outbreak in a ship. So in the military, there's very definitely that balance of risk between delivering the military mission versus protecting the health of the soldiers, sailors and airmen who are conducting military operations. I'll hand back over to David if you wanted to add anything extra.
Thank you. Marina, did you have any points that you wanted to add before I answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just a second. So To the first question, we will be using structured surveys to measure the impact of the cards, and we are working on a data set so that we can analyze it with something like SPSS or Stata and build models, predictive models, in terms of how these cards help to shape behavior, to shape ethical behavior in conflict environments. So that would be my extension to the first question. And the second question, I think it's ethics versus order. I think it's not quite the phrasing I would use. We have already established that ethical behavior actually increases military effectiveness. So I wouldn't phrase it this way. I would say that it depends on the situation. It's not something prescriptive that we're offering. We're offering an analytical tool which should be used in any situation, such as ethical triangulation. And depending on which approach one chooses to use, the answer will depend on that. And when one uses it, one would be thinking about the context and about the situation one is in and what would increase the effectiveness of the operation. Thank you.
So both excellent answers there. I'll just add to the second question, which is they're both good questions, but the second one, particularly really interesting one in this environment. I would say that a rules-based approach can be very effective, but it requires A, that the rules are the right ones, B, that the rules are actually understood, and C, that people are equipped with the ethical decision-making tools to be able to prioritize which rule is supposed to be followed when they come into conflict. And that is, so for example, the balancing of mission accomplishment with the duty of care to personnel. And you can only answer that last one if you embrace education rather than simply training. Training's excellent with a rules-based approach, telling you what to do in a specific situation. But if it's not that specific situation that you've been trained for, a rules-based approach can be extremely problematic, which is why education is required as well as training, so that you can interpret context and actually do the right thing in the situation.
Thank you very much. I personally thought we had a very exciting 1.5 hours with a great variety of topics discussed. I would like to bring proceedings to a close now. I hope you found it as stimulating as I found the last 1.5 hours, or the last hour, I should say. Thank you very much for our great panelists. Thank you for the School of Security Studies for hosting and putting together the event. And thank you for all the panelists who have bombarded us with questions. Any questions that have been left unanswered, please get in touch with us, and we are more than happy to engage. That was part of the whole point of the entire session. If you are now, your appetite has been whetted and you missed all the other events, please go to YouTube next week and start binge watching some intellectually stimulating fare. So thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend, and farewell. Thank you.
Thank you.